Welcome to the Future is Freelance podcast, bringing together the best minds from the freelance ecosystem. We honor the expertise that comes from all levels, from freelancer to platform CEO, from community builder to enterprise leader. Together, we'll define the future of work. If you value this content, there are two ways you can support it. Follow this podcast wherever you get it and leave a positive review, or share the podcast with a friend. Find out more about our movement, including live events, coaching, and tons more content at fruitioninitiatives.com. Thanks for being part of the movement. Hi, Matt.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
I'm super excited to have this conversation today. Let's just dive right in with the three questions that we start off at the top. I ask them all in a clump because the answers mostly bleed together anyway. Can you tell us, who are you, what is your work, and why do you do it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Matt Dowling. I'm the Freelancer Club's founder, an organization that empowers freelancers with the skills to succeed. That's our tagline. But more broadly speaking, we facilitate thousands of job opportunities. We drive policy in the self-employed sector, campaign for various rights, and act as a community for thousands of solopreneurs. In terms of what my work is, it's evolved quite a bit over the 10 years since we launched. And to this day, no one day is the same, which is the way I like it. So company-wide, I focus on strategy, but most of my energy is on our educational division and our advocacy work. And why I do it? Well, most founders, I think the company was born out of a personal experience. In my case, that involved a $15,000 unpaid invoice and some other stuff that we might or might not get into. But more broadly, I do it because one of my core values is an intolerance of injustice, and the self-employed sector tends to get a pretty rough ride in certain sectors. And so I think I probably deep down want to right those wrongs and ensure that what happened to folks like myself when I was starting out doesn't happen to people in the future.
Awesome. Great. There's so many things that I want to touch on there. Let's start with the policy aspect. I think when you and I first had our conversation after we got connected, the thing that I think is so unique and interesting about what you do and your organization is that it really does hit on all of these fronts. So I know people that do policy and advocacy. I know people that do community, that do education, that run communities. But I think I don't often come across people who do all of those things and have all those things married and working together. So I wonder if we want to start off by talking about just like what the community looks like. Because I know what you said, it's evolved as these things do over the 10 years that you've been doing it. And like, where did it start? I'd love to hear that origin story that you hinted at. And then like, where did the community start and how, I guess my question is like, which of these pieces came first? And then like, how did it evolve from there?
So you want to start with the trauma, I see. Okay.
I would like to start with the trauma if we can go.
Just to set the tone for the podcast.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to give you the abridged version and then we can get into the shinier stuff. So I was a accidental freelancer, which means I had no plans to be a freelancer. I just couldn't get a full-time job. And somebody asked me if I would take photos of their cousin's wedding. And the entire kind of proviso for that was I owned a camera. There was nothing else that got me the job other than that physical chunk of plastic that I had. And I knew how to take photos. I'd majored in photography and contemporary art at university. I did that. And whilst I was there, someone else asked if I would take photos at their wedding. Again, zero interview process there. And that made a little bit of money and really initially done as a favor, and it started to snowball with other bits and pieces that came in. And before I knew it, I realized I was bringing in fairly regular income, and this was very enjoyable, and it made more sense than continually getting rejected when I was applying for jobs. That was the starting point to discover what freelancing was, bearing in mind I had very little business acumen or understanding of how that whole world worked. And after a couple of years of doing that and figuring out on the job, I got a really exciting opportunity with a fashion company. So they were online retail. It's a number of years ago now. So it was early stage e-com, and it was a little bit like the Wild West still. They were ahead of their time, I felt. And I got a gig running the entire fashion side of that process, which was very exciting. I got to pick and choose my team, and I had a lot of strong connections in that space. And so I was able to produce what I thought was really exciting work. And for a year, that relationship was great. So much so that I ditched all of my other clients and put all my energy into these one guys. And then year two, I didn't get my invoice paid 1 month. And I was just an accountancy error. So they told me. And the second month was a technical glitch. And then the third month, I had to borrow a bit of money from friends. And the fourth month was they're going through some changes. And then I really had to borrow more money, and it was getting touch and go whether I could afford rent. And I hit a point where I was so broke that I found where their head office was. I'd never been there before. And I swung the doors open, and it was completely empty. And it transpired that they had gone bankrupt, and they were using myself and my team to shoot the last of their stock to try and generate a little more cash. And I ended up at the bottom of a long list of people that they owed money to, and sadly never got paid. So that was the $15,000 or £11,000 invoice. I had to do the quick currency calculation. So it's something in that ballpark. And to add onto the tragedy, a journalist heard about the story and said, "Can we do a piece on your sad life and this situation that's happened?" And I said, "Of course. That sounds amazing." This is the national press. So it went all over the country. And the title was "The Face of the Recession." The funny part about that was a photographer came over to take my photo for the paper and asked me to smile. And I said, "I don't know if that's a suitable pose for this article." And he said, "No, it'll be okay." So I look like a moronic smiling photographer with the headline "Face of the Recession" over it. And off the back of that, a lot of freelancers reached out to say, "I read the article and something similar happened to me," not the same company, but similar exploitative experience. And I set up a Facebook group at the time, and that shows you how old the story is. But that group was a really interesting moment. It was a conversation where people would reach out and say, "What should I do?" They were asking for advice as if I would know, but I would scramble for the answer online and try and be as helpful as possible. Ironically, at a time when I was so broke, I was effectively packing up my stuff to fly back to Ireland, which is where I'm originally from. And found myself really being of service and feeling good about that, and feeling useful at a time when I was pretty low, and it was pretty dire, if I'm being honest. And then somebody reached out to say, "I'd love for you to come in and talk to our group about your experience and maybe give them a little insight into your life as a freelancer." And then they said the magic word, which is, "We'll pay you." And I said, "Okay, I'm in." Slowly, I started to pick myself back up and get things going again. Some other ventures happened in between, but that was most definitely the seed that would later become Freelancer Club and develop into what the platform is today.
I think it's a really important story. I know it's not a fun story to look back on. I think as freelancers, we all have a different version of that story, which may not even be like not getting paid, but oh, like I lost an ongoing contract, not expecting to, and wasn't sure how I was going to pay my rent the next month. Or we all have some version of that story where it's like that thing that you look back on where you're like, I know I can't go, whatever happens, I know I can't go back there. That can't happen again. And that's I can only imagine how visceral that is for folks reading, having read that, and just that natural instinct to reach out to you to be like, "Oh, I'm not the only person who has a story like this." So tell us about from there, from the Facebook group. It started with community. It started with, I also love what you said because it from the beginning place, I am always like, there's no one that is an expert at this. I think there's a lot of people who are out there running communities or doing coaching like I do or other things like that. But fundamentally, no one is an expert at this. Some of us are like have more time behind the wheel, But I love what you said that even when you started the Facebook group, people were reaching out and asking for help, and you're like, I wasn't totally sure what the answer was, so I just went to try and find the answer, and we solved it together. Tell us about the evolution of from the community, how you branched out into some of the things that you're focused on now in terms of, I'd love to really dive deeper on like the policy and both the education stuff that you're doing that I think is super interesting.
I'll start with the education. So we were probably 3 or 4 years in, and we used to get asked by universities to come in and talk to the students about freelancing, and we were happy to do it. It was very casual. And so we would tell them a bit about the club. We would tell them about freelancing and behind the curtain. I would often traumatize myself with that story again, just keep reliving it over and over. And that would, I think, help them better understand the realities of what was still a very, very niche pathway for students of that age. This was well before the side hustle boom. And I think freelancing was very much for folks who had put in the time in a traditional job rather, and then decided to go freelance later in life. So it was still pretty raw, but private academies would ask us to go in, let's say a makeup academy, or often folks in a creative space, knowing they would most likely have to engage in freelancing at some stage. And they wanted to hear from someone who had been there and done that a little bit. And then over the pandemic, we started to, first of all, we needed to find ways to try and be useful and try and develop some of the ideas that we had to stay afloat, frankly. And with that, we really worked on our educational piece, which had bit by bit grown to be slightly more formal and structured over the years. So we were delivering programs at university. They now had a commercial aspect to it. It was no longer just an ad hoc volunteer thing we did. It was a lot more structured and serious. And from there, we started to build on it. And others in the sector, in the educational sector in the UK, really started to recognize that there was a great demand for this information. Students were naturally looking to generate additional cash, running side hustles, but there was zero support at the time. And then others were aspiring to go full-time freelance straight out of graduation. And so they needed a little bit of guidance. So we started to do a lot of work around this. It's really boomed over the last 4 or 5 years to the point where we are supporting tens of thousands of students every year. We go way beyond the business training of business basics, branding, marketing, sales. And we have psychotherapists delivering mindset workshops. We have one-to-one coaching that keeps people on track with accountability and momentum. We do a lot of work around core skills. We're introducing AI trainers. We've really doubled down in this whole sector, asking the question, how can we best prepare somebody for this world when we know so much of it is learned on the job? Can we give them some tools to help prepare them for the next few months at least, so that they can get that early money in and start picking up some of the know-how whilst they're freelancing? And then the policy piece, I've always just felt goes hand in glove with everything we've done. We have built up a fair amount of influence. We have nearly 72,000 members. We've got a decent voice in the community. And I just felt it was our duty to get involved in that piece. So it's not something that we do commercially. It's something that we do off our own bat. And it stemmed really from being asked to come in and contribute to working groups or collectives and try and give a take on what the freelance experience is. And that then piqued our interest into how we could be more useful and perhaps start to develop some of the ideas that we had. So when we launched the company, we did so with the campaign called No Free Work, off the back of that story I told you about, my story. And it was an attempt to end exploitative unpaid work in the industry. And we took the little steps. We refused to post unpaid work on our platform. We didn't want a witch hunt, so we didn't call anybody out who was doing it, but we did quietly reach out to them to say, look, this is the impact it's having on the community. Could we ask you to introduce a budget? So just very small changes. But it grew arms and legs. It trended on Twitter a couple of times. It started to get a lot of attention from other people in the industry. And it took us all the way to the House of Lords in government, where we sat around a table with a lot of powerful people and politicians and MPs to discuss a potential legislative change. Then Brexit happened in the UK and all bets were off, basically. So we started from scratch. But I'm delighted to say that in the last few months, I've accepted a position as chairman of a working group associated with this new government in the UK, and with a lot of funding behind it, with the British Film Institute. And we will be working towards implementing some of these policies that hopefully, touch wood, will come into legislation in the UK and act as a template that we could potentially roll out across other countries. So let's see where it goes, but it's always been very much a passion project that has now turned out to be something that takes up a fair chunk of my time.
While we're on the policy piece, I want to pause there for 1 second, and then I do want to circle back to the education stuff. But I'm curious, and I know this is probably like a very complex answer. Maybe give us the 30,000-foot view. But what I know that we had talked about some of the legislation that has happened in the United States around payment protection for freelancers, and with your like no free work slogan, obviously that's like a core part of the policies. But I'm curious, like, when you guys think about policy, what kinds of policies are we talking about besides payment protection? Are there other, like, I can think of things in the United States when I'm thinking about taxes or regulations around who can and cannot like what constitutes a freelancer versus a full-time worker. I'm just curious, like, what those kind of like policy planks look like, and what are the core pieces of that y'all are thinking about?
Well, to bring it back full circle, we were really inspired by the Freelancers Union's Freelancing Isn't Free bill. And Sarah Horowitz, the founder of Freelancers Union, actually dialed into that roundtable that I mentioned. And we wanted to try and use that as a template for the UK to see could we replicate some of those ideas. So mandatory contracts was one of them, or something called double damages. If a client is found wanting, not paying an invoice, then the freelancer could potentially have them pay twice the value of the contract. So we really liked those ideas. We thought they were really innovative and tangible and something that we felt we could introduce into the UK. So we would look at areas like payment. So late payment is a hot topic that we're looking to try and solve. The behaviors of companies, of freelancers, of the self-employed, just bringing in more protections. We're also having conversations around the possibility of sick pay, which some insurances cover at the moment. But yeah, there's 5 working groups who are trying to deal with lots of different things. It's quite a complex area. And for us, the 2 areas that I'm involved in, one is the behavioral piece around unpaid work, which in itself is pretty chunky. And then the second one is around IP. And we could be here all night trying to talk about that. And really the umbrella view of it is, can we try and get a little more protection for the self-employed and a little more clarity about how they can tap into that protection so that work is more fair? And I think that the fairness piece that's the key word. I think we want to try and make freelancing and working for yourself something that doesn't feel so high risk. I was speaking to somebody in the States. We recently started dipping our toe in your neck of the woods and speaking to universities and colleges about potentially working together. And only recently have I discovered just how incredibly impactful the health insurance piece is for you there, and just what a barrier that is for freelancers and how much that's changed over time. So we're incredibly fortunate in the UK that we have free healthcare, and you know that's just a given for people who want to set up their own businesses. It's far more frictionless when it comes to launching. So we're looking at all these bits and pieces to try and make it a much smoother sail for anybody that wants to freelance. The government here talks a lot about growth and driving business forward. They also talk a lot about skills and trying to ensure everyone has access to skills in the hope that'll stimulate the economy. And with that, we need to create fertile ground to try and ensure anyone who does want to take this career path feels that they're protected and can have a pretty good crack at it. So that's what we're working on, a fairer working world for everybody.
Thank you. I know that's like obviously a very complex answer, but I think that's a perfect It's a really nice summary, and I think you're highlighting that key difference, one of the key differences between the US market versus the UK market or other places in the world. The health insurance thing is real. It for sure. Okay, I'd love to circle back and maybe just like connect back to the education piece. I think I'm curious about how, and again, I know this is more like a big question, but how have you seen the evolution of teaching people how to freelance? So obviously y'all have been at this for a long time. As you said, it went from more of an informal thing to a formal thing. In the work that I do, I've watched that in my own practice where it's like in the beginning, no one taught me how to freelance, as I think happens with most people, right? You just stumble through it and then, like, sometimes find people that have done it and they will be like, "Oh, no, go do that thing." And then you'll be like, "Okay, I'm gonna take that thing and I'm gonna stumble through it a little bit more." And so when I, like, first started thinking about, like, how do I, quote, unquote, "teach people how to freelance," or how do I help people get better leverage in freelancing, it was a little hard to figure out something that I had just not naturally, but stumbled through. What are the actual steps? And so I'm curious, not necessarily an overview of the curriculum, but how have you seen that evolve for you guys with what is now, I would assume, like an actual curriculum, that evolution of something that, and you had highlighted this balance too, of there's a piece of this which is true with all jobs that you cannot learn unless you're just doing it. And so it's like that, what is the evolution of that curriculum over time from this like informal to the formal? And then also just to add an additional layer of complexity, that layer between the piece of it that like can be taught versus the piece of it that you're just like, you just got to go try.
Mm. Let me try and to unpack that with a quick story, then I'll loop
Thank you.
back to a more kind of straight answer. There's this guy, his name's Leo, and he has two great loves in his life. One is a border terrier, you know, that breed of
Mhm.
dog,
Yep.
and the other is punk music. And Leo needed to buy a jacket for his dog, which is almost an existential crisis for a lot of dog owners, whether you go down that road or not. It's a slippery slope. But it is quite tricky to find the right size for your dog because it's limited in terms of what you can buy online, and every dog has a different size. And Leo's border terrier was a little bit of a funky size. He had no luck on Google, and he went onto Facebook, where he discovered there was groups dedicated to border terriers. Now it transpires that border terrier owners are all lunatics, and they absolutely love their border terriers. That's their whole life. And any post that goes onto a Facebook group dedicated to border terriers was getting 500 likes and comments and highly engaged. And Leo thought, wow, this is really intense, but I think I'm going to get my answer here. So he throws the question in, and within 2 seconds, somebody sends him a link, and hey presto, he gets the perfect jacket. He then thinks, wow, this is a cool group. I love my border terrier, and I found other like-minded people. So he posts a few other funny bits and pieces, like edgy, punky comments about border terriers, but very light. And people all really responded. He referenced a border terrier joke from his favorite punk album, the Sex Pistols. And it got a lot of laughs. And someone said, you should stick that on a t-shirt. It's a really funny line. And he said, oh yeah, maybe I will. And he starts to look online how we can do that. And he finds these mugs, these cups, rather than a t-shirt. But he goes, okay, cool. I'm going to put that design. I'll do a little Photoshop. I'll put that Sex Pistols concept with the border terrier joke on the mug. And he sticks it back onto Facebook. And 10 people say, where did you buy that? I want to get that. And he says, oh, I just mocked it up in Photoshop, but let me see what I can do. So he finds a print company who also delivers and packages, and gets in touch with them and says, how much would that cost? And he makes these 10 deals, these 10 sales of his mug. He can't believe his luck. He charges a few quid and gets a little bit of money in, and then he realizes I can design more of these. And so he starts to produce a whole series of these cups with edgy punk border terrier themed designs on them. And they're selling like hotcakes. He can't believe his luck. He's also into cricket a little bit, and he goes to his local cricket club and discovers there's a centenary coming up, and he can also design cups for them. And they love that. And he said, right, forget the single cups. We want to buy 600. So he gets rid of his Etsy page. He brings a printer into his house. He cuts out the percentage. He cuts out the middleman, and he's now turning over a couple of grand every month. And the reason I tell you this story is because Leo is 13 years old. Leo has no concept of business. Leo has no background in business, but inherently he knew how to identify an audience. He knew his USP in the market. He knew how to reduce his overheads. He knew how to turn a profit. He had all of this insight instinctively. And I think we all do. We're negotiating on the playground when you want the swing and someone else is on it, or you want 2 hours extra TV time when it's bedtime. We are building up all of these skills. We just don't have the language or the framework to be able to inject them into business to be fully safe. So a lot of the time, we're not really teaching business in a sort of formal, bookish way. We're trying to explain the rules of the game to individuals who instinctively already know it and give them a framework to be able to join and thrive in that environment. How it's evolved, I think, is when we started to go beyond the practical elements of business. So we might teach somebody a concept of return on investment or the idea of a financial projection. And then we thought, okay, what happens when you get rejected 50 times in a week applying for freelance jobs? How are you going to bounce back? And we wanted to teach people a couple of techniques and provide them with a toolkit, emotionally speaking, to be able to combat that, or even use it to shift a strategy and try something different. We then wanted to see if we could teach people how they could communicate better or become better organizers. So we would extract and identify what we felt to be the key learning points that an elite freelancer would use. And then we started to think, what's the best way to impart this information? Can we create real world scenarios? Can it be interactive? Can we give them a playground to practice where they don't feel embarrassed? So we looked at all of these aspects to build out what we think is a fairly sophisticated but malleable curriculum that anybody can tap into. It's completely universal. It's completely global. Anybody can try and use some of these techniques, and we have coaches to keep you on track and keep you motivated. So there's a number of different elements that come into a program depending on what the client needs. And with that, we've started to see some great results. And look, when we started out, it was really hit and miss. We were, to a degree, learning ourselves on the job. We had to discover only by doing what was producing results. And now we're in a place where we're going to keep learning and keep evolving. And AI has introduced a whole new potential way of teaching and helping people to learn some of these skills that are difficult to teach in the classroom that we've been pushing out. That's really exciting. But we're seeing incredible results. Individuals who ordinarily have had no background in business are landing paid jobs and what we call early money a lot quicker than they used to. So we now have some strong quantifiable data around that. And we think we've struck on a curriculum and a framework that's really changing the dial. So that's what gets me excited now, that we can help people enter an entrepreneurial state a lot quicker. And from there, let them fly. Really, after a period of time, our job is done to a degree, and they will then start to explore all sorts. A lot go on to set up startups, companies, scale-ups, whatever. Some stay freelance, some go into traditional employment, maybe run a side hustle, dip back in, dip back out, but they've built up all of these skills that are incredibly transferable. And in a lot of cases, even in traditional employment, they're very much sought after. So what we're pushing for now really is we'd love to see entrepreneurial skills introduced to students at a much younger age. And in an ideal world, I'd love to see it as a mandatory track for people to know about and then make the decision themselves. As education forever has just filtered people through one particular type of work, which is Go get yourself a job, 9 to 5. If possible, get yourself into college and get a little bump in pay rise every year and buy the house. What we're saying is that world it's no longer there. Job for life is long gone. And the portfolio career, the squiggly career, call it what you like, is is the now and the future. And we're not preparing students for the working world, and that needs to change.
It as you're saying this, I am also in my mind seeing this connection between I think you're right, it's like giving people it's almost giving people permission to be able to do this because, like you said, it's not the way that jobs have been taught. But you're doing it's like these 2 intersecting ways that you're doing that. You're giving them this sort of, like, framework to be like, "Hey, I know this feels like rocket science, but I promise it's not. Here's the framework." And then on the other side, you're trying to take away some of that inherent risk on the policy side. So you're saying that, "Hey, we're gonna give you the framework to prove to you that this is inherent in you. We know you can do this. Here's the sort of blueprint for how to go about it." And then on the other side, you're saying, "We also know that this is risky, so that we're working on the policy side to give you a little bit more courage and have the infrastructure be able to support you in making this decision." So it's really like this perfect combination to be able to help people, especially young people. I can't imagine I didn't even know that to your point, I didn't even know that freelancing was a possibility when I was in college or high school. Like, it never occurred to me. And my parents own their own business. I am a second generation entrepreneur, and it literally never even occurred. I was like, either you own this business, like my parents did, or you go work for someone else. It didn't occur to me that you could be like a solo independent operator and make decent money, be fulfilled, all those kinds of things. So that intersection, I think, is so important and super interesting in the patchwork quilt of all things that, you and your organization are doing.
Just on that point about risk, I've actually changed my opinion on risk because I think you're right. I think most stakeholders look at setting up a business as a far riskier option, and going freelance gets chucked into that same bucket. But I would have a counter argument to that and say freelancing is far less risky than taking a 9 to 5 job. And the day I changed my mind was when somebody told me a story about their parents who both worked for different companies for 20, 30 years, got laid off over the pandemic and suddenly lost everything. They also felt, what else are we going to do? That they were totally embedded into this company and felt like that was all they knew. They were of a certain age where their confidence probably wasn't in a place where they thought they could re-enter the market. And the daughter was telling me the story, saying from that day on, I recognized how freelancing with multiple clients was a much safer bet than putting all of your eggs in one basket. And if you lose a freelance client, 2 things happen. One, you have a bunch of other clients to fall back on, so you should be okay. And 2, you've got the skill set to find more clients as well. You live in a place as a freelancer of, at times, I hate the word hustle, but at times having to go out there and find new work. But also that idea of being able to adapt very quickly, well, that's a skill that you don't exercise if you're working in traditional employment. So I do appreciate both opinions, but I think freelancing is less risky than starting a startup, for instance, because of what I've described. And I think it's a great way to slowly enter this world, into this entrepreneurial world, and do in a way that I think enables you to take less risk and explore and start to figure it out over time whilst generating income, whilst being able to pay your rent. It's not some sort of hobby or stopgap. It is a very viable career path. And the younger generation has clocked this. They do not, in my experience, have the same trepidation as my generation would. So folks in their 40s and 50s who 20 years ago, that would have been deemed as high risk. I remember when I went freelance, when I officially figured out I was freelance, and that took a while. And my mates were saying, wow, you're really brave. Some said I'm really stupid. And they were the 2 options. And when I speak to this generation who are, say, in their 20s, they do not think like that. The side hustle is just a no-brainer. It's a way easier way to make money than working in the bar or the coffee shop. It's a way to express yourself, to take control, to have autonomy, to be able to travel. It aligns with all of those Gen Z values. And that, I think, is changing the game. And hopefully for the better. It'll drive the economy, it'll stimulate that whole space. It'll end up with more small businesses and more innovative and entrepreneurial marketplaces. It'll employ more people. It'll support other companies. I think it's a really exciting space to have a younger freelance population.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think that it is something that I have been shouting from the rooftops for years, that it is the belief that a traditional employment is more secure is a myth. It is just simply not true, and I think in addition to all the points that you made about why that's not true, back to the point about in the US, it also means that you lose a job, you lose all your benefits. So, just to add another layer of in the US, obviously, if you're a freelancer and getting your own benefits, that is another additional barrier, but at least that's something that is yours, that goes with you no matter where you are, and so I could not agree more. I think the other thing that you're hitting on there is just this thing that you said already too, is that it's not just a myth, but it's like a indoctrination that our generation and those older than us have been led to believe that traditional 9 to 5 employment is the secure thing to do and is the only way. And generations coming up behind us know that not to be true. And so I think it's a huge generational mindset shift. And I cannot agree more that I think it is only going to pave the way for greater autonomy, freedom, economic growth, all those things. But yeah, I could not agree more. I think it is inherently less risky.
Or at least the choice, like just to give people the choice. Of course, you and I are going to say freelancing is great.
Yeah.
That's our world. And cognizant that this just could become an echo chamber of patting each other on the back. But give people the choice. It's not the perception of going freelance, I don't think is well represented. And I don't think people fully appreciate the realities of it. I also
Yeah.
fully accept that one of the key stakeholders is parents. And if you were to say that as a child to a parent that this is what you want to do, alarm bells are going to go crazy because your instinct of wanting to protect your kid and have the best for your kid and for your kid to be safe all kicks in, and your instinct is to say a real job equals security. And in the States, as you rightly say, that also comes with benefits and another layer of security. And freelancing equals startup, I think. I don't really know what that means. But ultimately, that's much more high risk. And I don't want my baby to be financially in trouble. And so that it's perfectly natural. I really can empathize and appreciate that. And I think a big part of the work that we do is to try and demystify that, change the culture around freelancing, show people the realities of it, because their kids are going to need to know a lot of this stuff. If the projections are true, and that's everything from the founder of LinkedIn saying that the 9 to 5 is going to be extinct by 2036, or the stat around more freelancers than employees within 3 years in the States, if all these come to pass, and everything would suggest that it's certainly on that trajectory. Not sure about the former statement being entirely accurate, but I think we're going to need to know this stuff. We're going to have to start to embrace those entrepreneurial skills at some point. And that's our theory. That's what we think. All of the signs are pointing that way. And we just need to do a little work around the key stakeholders to get them on board with this idea so that we can better help the generations coming through.
Yep. I think that is the perfect place to leave us. Thank you so much for being here and having this conversation with us. Can you tell us more about where we can find out more about you and Freelancer Club?
Yeah, Freelancer Club is all over the place on socials, and type it into Google, it'll pop up, or freelancerclub.net. And you can interact and get in touch with us if you want a conversation about all things freelance.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.